I have told this story so many times in my own head, lying awake at 3 in the morning with the harbor wind rattling the window glass, that I sometimes forget which parts I actually said out loud and which parts I only screamed inside myself. But here is the truth, and I promise you, by the time I am finished, you will understand why I still cannot walk past a birthday cake without my hands going cold. The most frightening part of everything that happened was not what my daughter finally said that night. It was realizing, weeks later, that every single person sitting around that table had already noticed something was wrong long before she stood up. We had all seen it. We had all felt the silence sitting in the room like a damp fog rolling in off Kinsale Harbor. And every last one of us had quietly decided it was none of our business. My name is Bridget O'Sullivan. I am 76 years old. I taught piano and choral music in Cork City for the better part of 4 decades, and I have lived in the same stone house on Upper O'Connell Street in Kinsale since the year I married my husband, Declan. If you have ever wandered through Kinsale yourself, you will know the kind of house I mean. Thick walls that keep out the Atlantic damp. A black iron knocker shaped like a fish, because half the doors in this town have one. A view, if you stand at just the right angle in the back garden, of the masts bobbing down in the marina and the old fortifications of Charles Fort across the water, standing guard the way they have since the days of King William. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something, and I would love for you to answer me honestly in the comments below. Has there ever been a silence in your own family that everyone agreed, without ever discussing it, simply to live inside of? Tell me where you are watching this from tonight. I read every single comment, I promise you that. And if this story already has its hooks in you, do me the kindness of pressing that like button, because it tells me you want to keep walking down this road with me. Subscribe if you have not already, because I have a great deal more to tell you, and I am not the sort of woman who tells a story halfway. Now then, let me take you back to where it truly began, though I did not know it was a beginning at the time. I thought it was simply an ordinary Tuesday. It was the kind of gray Kinsale morning where the fog sits low over the water, and the gulls sound like they are arguing about something personal. I was standing at my kitchen window with my tea going cold in my hands, watching Declan in the back garden fussing over his runner beans, which he has grown every single summer of our marriage with a devotion he has never quite managed to show his own blood pressure readings. The radio was on, the local station, someone discussing the weather for the Kinsale Gourmet Festival, which was still some months off, and I remember thinking how ordinary everything sounded. Then the telephone rang. It was my daughter, Maeve. Maeve O'Sullivan Byrne is 48 years old, and she works as an archivist at the university in Cork, the kind of job where she spends her days surrounded by other people's old letters, other people's old secrets, carefully preserved behind acid-free paper and white cotton gloves. It has always struck me as a strange thing for my daughter to have chosen, given how fiercely she has spent her own adult life trying not to look backward. Maeve called to ask what she should bring to her father's birthday dinner, a bottle of wine, a particular kind of brown bread, nothing remarkable. But then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "Is him coming?" Not Siren. Him. I laughed, actually laughed because I assumed she was joking, the way siblings sometimes tease one another with exaggerated formality. I said something like, "Of course your brother is coming, Maeve. It is his father's 75th birthday. What a question." And there was a pause on the line, a pause just a half-second too long. And then she simply said, "Fine," and changed the subject to whether I wanted white wine or red. I want you to sit with me in that pause for a moment, because I certainly have, more times than I can count since. At the time, I told myself it meant nothing. We convince ourselves of so much, don't we, when the alternative is too uncomfortable to hold. If you have not yet told me where in the world you are listening from tonight, I would love to know. Drop it in the comments. And tell me what time it is for you right now, because I find it strange and rather beautiful to imagine all these different clocks ticking in all these different houses while one old woman in Kinsale tells her story. If you are finding yourself leaning in, give this video a like. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to a channel like this one. We post a brand new story regularly, so do subscribe if you would like to walk these roads with me again. Now, to understand what happened at that dinner table, you first have to understand my two children, because they could not have grown into more different people if I had raised them on opposite sides of the country. Kieran O'Sullivan is 54, my eldest, a financial consultant who has lived in Galway for the better part of 20 years. As a boy, he was the sort of child who fixed things before you even knew they were broken. He took apart our old wireless radio at 9 years old and put it back together better than it had been before. He has always had that mind, the kind that sees systems and patterns where the rest of us simply see chaos. He calls me every Sunday evening at exactly 7 o'clock without fail, a habit so consistent that if the phone has not rung by 10 past, I find myself glancing at the clock with a small, unreasonable worry. Maeve, on the other hand, was always the watcher, the quiet one in the corner with a book. Though do not let that fool you, because underneath that quiet she has always carried a fierce, exacting sense of right and wrong, the kind that does not forgive easily and does not forget at all. She adored her older brother when she was small. I have photographs, somewhere in a box up in the attic, of the two of them down on Silly Walk by the water, Kieran no older than 14, Maeve perhaps 8, his hand wrapped protectively around hers as they picked their way along the rocks at low tide. They were close in a way that made other parents envious. I remember a neighbor once telling me she had never seen siblings so fond of one another, which is precisely why what happened over these past years has confused me so deeply, and why I still, even now telling you this, feel a strange tightness behind my ribs, trying to make sense of it. It did not happen all at once. That is the thing nobody tells you about a fracture like this one. It is not a single dramatic blow. It is a slow accumulation of small absences, the way damp slowly works its way into stone until one day the whole wall is soft and crumbling and you cannot say exactly when it happened, only that it did. I noticed it first, I think, 2 Christmases ago. We always do the cards together as a family, the old-fashioned way, sitting around the dining table with a pot of tea and Declan's mother's recipe for mince pies filling the house with the smell of cloves and brandy. Each of us signs the cards going out to extended family and old friends. That year, I happened to glance at a card meant for Declan's cousin in Bantry, and I noticed Maeve's signature was there, and mine, and Declan's, but Ciaran's was not. I assumed he had simply forgotten, or perhaps had not yet arrived that evening. I did not think anything more of it. But then I noticed it again, and again. Every card that went out that winter bore 3 signatures instead of 4, and the 4th name missing was always the same one. I am going to pause here for just a moment because I want to ask you something that has stayed with me. Have you ever watched someone you love slowly erase another person from their life? Not through anger, not through shouting, but through small, quiet omissions that anyone could explain away if questioned? If that has ever happened in your own family, I would be honored if you shared a little of it in the comments below, because I think we carry less shame when we realize how many of us have lived through something similar. And if this story is resonating with you so far, please, take half a second and tap that like button. It helps this story find the people who might need to hear it. There is more coming, so do stay with me, and consider subscribing so you never miss where this road leads. By the following spring, the cards had become photographs. We had a family gathering for Declan's nephew's confirmation, held over in Cork City, and afterwards someone printed out copies for everyone, the way families do. In the photograph from that day, I noticed Maeve had positioned herself at the very far end of the group, practically standing with our cousin's elderly aunt, rather than anywhere near her own brother. I remember looking at that photograph for a long while, turning it over in my hands as though the back of it might explain the front. And then, of course, there was the matter of how she spoke about him. It started so subtly that I genuinely cannot tell you the exact week it began. She stopped saying his name. Where once she might have said, "Did Ciaran ring you?" or "What does Ciaran think of the new extension on the house?" she began saying instead, Did he ring you? Or, what does he think? At first I assumed it was simple habit, the kind of linguistic shortcut that happens between siblings who have known each other their whole lives. But habits like that do not usually carry the particular flatness I began to hear in her voice. There was something deliberate in it, something almost surgical, the way you might avoid pressing your tongue against a sore tooth. I tried gently to ask her about it once, on a walk we took together along the path out past Charles Fort, the kind of walk Maeve and I have taken together since she was a girl, with the gorse blooming bright yellow along the hedgerows and the Atlantic wind doing its best to take the words right out of your mouth before you can finish a sentence. I asked her, plainly, whether something had happened between herself and her brother. She looked out at the water for a long moment, the kind of long moment that tells you the answer is going to be a careful one, and she said, "Nothing happened, ma'am. That's rather the problem." I did not understand what she meant. I am not certain, if I am honest with you, that I fully understand it even now, though I have come a great deal closer than I was that day on the cliff path. If you are still with me, I want to thank you sincerely, from one old woman to whoever is out there listening tonight. These stories take a great deal out of me to tell, more than you might imagine, and knowing that someone is sitting with me through it means more than you know. Tell me, has there ever been a moment when someone you loved gave you an answer that somehow only deepened the mystery rather than solving it? I would love to read your experience in the comments. And please, if you have not already, subscribe to this channel, because there is so much more of this particular story left to tell. And I have other stories besides this one. Stories I have lived, and stories I have been trusted to carry on behalf of others. Let me tell you a little more about my husband Declan, because he matters a great deal to how all of this eventually came to its head. Declan O'Sullivan worked his whole career for the Harbour Board here in Kinsale, the sort of steady, unglamorous work that keeps a town like this one actually running, checking moorings, coordinating with the fishing fleets, making certain the gourmet festival each summer did not collapse into chaos over parking and tide schedules. He is not a man who enjoys conflict. I have been married to him for 51 years, and in all that time I can count on one hand the number of true arguments we have ever had, not because we agree on everything, far from it, but because Declan's instinct in the face of tension has always been to wait quietly until it resolves itself. It is, I have come to understand, both his greatest gift and his deepest flaw. When he turned 75 that year, he wanted nothing extravagant. Just a dinner, he said, just the family and a few old friends, somewhere with a decent view of the water, nothing fussy. We booked a private dining room above one of the old harborside restaurants, the kind of place where the windows look directly out over the boats, and if the evening is clear, you can watch the light change color over the water as the sun goes down behind the headland. Declan wanted Father Cathal there, our parish priest and an old friend of 40 years. He wanted his sister, Aunt Nuala, down from Clonakilty. He wanted, of course, both of his children there together, under one roof, for the first time in longer than any of us cared to admit out loud. I remember in the weeks leading up to that dinner feeling an unease I could not quite name. It was not dread, exactly. It was more like the feeling you get on Charles Fort Headland when the wind shifts suddenly, and you can smell rain coming long before you can see the clouds that will carry it. I want to pause here, because this next part is something I have never said aloud to anyone outside my own family, and even now my chest tightens telling it to you. About a week before Declan's birthday, I was tidying the front room, and I came across an old wooden box, the kind with a small brass clasp that had belonged to my own mother. Inside it, among ribbons and old rosary beads and a photograph of my parents on their wedding day outside the church in Bandon, there was a folded letter I did not recognize. It was addressed to me in Maeve's handwriting, but it had never been sent. The envelope was sealed. I held that letter in my hands for the longest time. I did not open it. Something in me, some old maternal instinct sharpened by 76 years of living, told me that whatever was inside that envelope was not meant to be read alone, in a quiet front room, by lamplight, without the rest of the story around it. I put it back in the box. I told no one I had found it, not even Declan. If you are the sort of person who likes a mystery you can sink your teeth into, I think you are exactly where you are meant to be tonight. Tell me in the comments, what do you imagine could be inside a letter someone writes and then never sends? I find that question almost more interesting than the answer itself, and I would love to hear your guesses, because some of you, I suspect, have lived through something not so very different. While you are down there, do leave a like, and if this is your first time with me, please subscribe, because what happened at that dinner table is something I will be telling you very soon, and I do not want you to miss a single word of it. The night of the dinner arrived the way these nights always do, with far too much fuss over what to wear, and Declan insisting 3 separate times that he did not want anyone making a fuss, which is, of course, precisely the behavior of a man who very much wants people to make a fuss, just quietly and on his own terms. We walked down from the house, because it is no great distance, past the colored shop fronts along the main street that give Kinsale its particular postcard charm, past the smell of turf smoke and fish and chips drifting out from the takeaway near the pier, down to the harbor where the boats sat low and patient on the water, their reflections trembling under the street lamps. Declan wore his good navy jacket. I wore the green dress Maeve had bought me 2 birthdays before, the one she said brought out my eyes, though I suspect she simply liked watching her father's face when I wore it. We arrived to find Aunt Nuala already seated, fussing over the table arrangement, and Father Cathal standing by the window with a small glass of sherry, admiring the boats. Old friends from the harbor board trickled in, men Declan had worked alongside for 30 years, their wives carrying small wrapped gifts and bottles of wine. And then Ciaran arrived. He looked well, I remember thinking. Tired, perhaps, the way a man in his 50s carrying the weight of a demanding career often looks tired, but well. He kissed my cheek, shook his father's hand with that particular firm warmth he has always had, and made his way around the room greeting everyone with the easy charm that has always made him good at his job and beloved by nearly everyone who has ever met him. Nearly everyone. Maeve arrived 20 minutes later, slightly breathless, apologizing for the parking near the marina, carrying a bottle of wine in one hand, and I noticed a slim leather folder tucked beneath her other arm, the sort of folder she might use for work documents, though it struck me as an odd thing to bring to a birthday dinner. I thought little of it at the time. I wish, looking back, that I had thought a great deal more of it. She greeted me warmly. She greeted her father with a long, tight embrace that brought a small, unexpected shine to his eyes. And when she turned toward her brother, the room, without anyone quite noticing it happening, seemed to hold its breath for half a second. "Ciaran," she said. His name. Spoken plainly, without flatness, without that careful avoidance I had grown so used to hearing over the past 2 years. I remember feeling something loosen in my chest, a small, unreasonable hope blooming there before I could stop it. I thought perhaps whatever had gone wrong between them had simply, quietly, mended itself, the way these things sometimes do, given enough time and enough love underneath the silence. I did not yet understand that she was not greeting a reconciliation. She was greeting a goodbye. If you have made it this far with me, I want you to know how grateful I am. This story is far from finished, and I promise you, what happens at that table will stay with you the way it has stayed with me every single day since. Before we go any further, please take a moment, comment, and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. Tell me what time your own clock reads as you sit with this old woman's memories. Give this video a like if you feel that pull in your chest the way I still do telling it. And subscribe, because I am not finished, not even close, and I do not want you to miss what is coming. Stay with me now, because we are about to walk into that dining room together, and I want you beside me when we do. I have always believed that a town shapes the people who grow old inside it. the same patient way the tide shapes a coastline, grain by grain, year by year, until you can no longer say where the stone ends and the water's influence begins. Kinsale has shaped every member of my family in ways I am only now, in my old age, beginning to fully understand. The town teaches you to be polite, even when your heart is breaking. It teaches you to nod to your neighbors on the street, even on the worst morning of your life. It teaches you, perhaps most dangerously of all, that some things are simply not discussed in front of company. That dining room above the harborside restaurant was warm with candlelight and the low hum of conversation when Maeve said her brother's name, and the rest of us, fools that we were, allowed ourselves to believe the worst had passed. Before I take you further into that room, I want to step back for just a little while, because I think you deserve to understand the deeper history beneath what was about to happen, the way Declan and I built the life that all of this nearly broke apart. I want to ask you something first, though, because I am curious. Have you ever sat in a room full of people you love, sensing that something was wrong, and chosen, just as we all did that night, to say nothing at all? I would love to hear about it in the comments below, because I think there is a strange comfort in discovering how common this particular silence truly is. If this story has its hold on you, give it a like. It helps more than you know, and if you have not yet subscribed, I would consider it a personal kindness, because I have walked a very long road to be able to tell you this one properly. Kinsale, if you have never visited, sits at the mouth of the River Bandon, where the river widens out and surrenders itself to the Atlantic. It was here, in the year 1601, that one of the most consequential battles in Irish history was fought, the Battle of Kinsale, where Spanish forces allied with the Irish chieftains made their final, doomed stand against the English crown. I have always found something quietly moving in the fact that I have spent my entire life in a town that was once the site of such enormous historical heartbreak. And yet today, it is known mostly for its painted shop fronts and its gourmet food festival and the gentle clinking of boat masts in the marina. Time, it seems, is endlessly patient with our wounds. It simply keeps laying new life over the old, the way moss eventually covers even the most violent stone. Declan and I were married in St. Maltos Church, which still stands at the top of the town, a building so old that parts of it date back to the 13th century, its graveyard filled with the weathered headstones of fishermen and merchants and soldiers who knew this harbor long before either of us were born. I remember standing at that altar at 25 years old, utterly certain that whatever life held for us, we would face it together, plainly, without secrets. It is a particular kind of arrogance, I think now, that only the young possess, the belief that love alone is sufficient architecture for an entire life. We built our family slowly. Kieran arrived first, 2 years into our marriage, a serious, watchful baby who rarely cried, as though even then he understood that the world required careful observation before action. Maeve came 6 years later, a different creature entirely, loud and curious, and utterly fearless, the sort of toddler who once wandered halfway down to the pier alone at 3 years old, simply because she wanted to see the boats up close, and gave both Declan and myself the fright of our lives. I taught piano in those years, mostly to children from the town and the surrounding townlands, and Declan worked his steady hours at the harbor board. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable, the particular comfortable of a working family in a small Irish coastal town in the latter decades of the last century, where a good dinner and a roof that did not leak counted as genuine prosperity. If you are enjoying the texture of this story so far, the history woven through it, I would love to know. Tell me in the comments what part of Ireland you yourself come from, or dream of visiting, because I find such joy imagining all of you scattered across the world, listening to an old Kinsale woman ramble through her memories. And please, if it is not too much to ask, leave this video a like and consider subscribing, because there is still so very much of this story left, and I promise you it only grows more important from here. Kieran left for university in Dublin at 18, studying commerce, the first in either of our families to attend university at all, a fact that filled Declan with a quiet, almost disbelieving pride he carried for years afterward. He excelled there in ways that did not surprise any of us who had watched him take apart that old wireless radio as a boy. He understood numbers the way some people understand music, intuitively, as though the patterns simply revealed themselves to him without effort. He eventually settled in Galway, built a career advising small businesses and family farms through the kind of financial complexities that terrify ordinary people, and married a lovely woman named Sinead, though that marriage, sadly, did not last past their 10th year together, ending amicably enough that Sinead still sends Declan a Christmas card every year out of what I can only describe as genuine, lingering fondness. Maeve, meanwhile, stayed closer to home for her studies, training in history and archival science at University College Cork, and eventually building her career there, cataloguing centuries of documents, letters, parish records, the quiet bureaucratic residue of countless lives long since ended. I have always thought it a strange irony that my daughter, who has spent her professional life preserving other people's hidden histories with such meticulous, gentle care, would one day find herself sitting on a hidden history of her own, one she could not bring herself to catalogue or file away neatly, no matter how badly she wished she could. The trouble, as best as I have since been able to piece it together, began roughly 8 years before that birthday dinner, though none of us knew it at the time, because none of us were told. Kieran had, for years, quietly managed a portion of the family's modest financial affairs, an arrangement that began innocently enough when Declan's hearing started to decline in his late 60s, and the paperwork from the Harbour Board pension, along with the small rental property we had purchased decades earlier out near Garrettstown, simply became easier to leave in our son's capable hands. It seemed at the time like nothing more than a son helping his aging parents, the sort of quiet generational handoff that happens in thousands of families without anyone giving it a second thought. What none of us knew, what I myself did not learn until many months after that dinner, was that during those same years, a small business venture Kieran had personally invested in, alongside 2 old university friends, had collapsed catastrophically during an economic downturn that hit the west of Ireland particularly hard. Kieran had not simply lost his own money. He had, in a moment of panic, he would later describe to me, through tears, as the single worst decision of his entire life, used a portion of funds tied to that rental property, funds that were legally still ours, to attempt to stabilize the failing business before it dragged down everything connected to it, fully intending, he insisted, to repay every cent before either of us ever noticed a difference. He did, eventually, repay it. Every cent, with interest he insisted upon adding himself, though it took him the better part of 6 years of quiet, grinding financial discipline to do so. But the doing of it, the secrecy required to manage it without our knowledge, the legal paperwork he altered and re-altered to keep the properties standing clean on paper while he worked to make us whole again, all of it required a level of concealment that, once Maeve discovered fragments of it during what began as an entirely unrelated piece of archival curiosity involving old land registry documents, she could not bring herself to simply forgive and forget. I want to be very careful here, because I do not want you to hear this and think my son is a villain in this story. He is not. He made a desperate, frightened decision at a moment when he believed, rightly or wrongly, that the alternative was watching his own father's modest retirement nest egg evaporate entirely in a collapse he felt at least partially responsible for. He chose secrecy because he believed, in his own deeply flawed reasoning, that protecting us from the truth was the same thing as protecting us from harm. It was not, but I have lived 76 years now, and if there is one thing this long life has taught me, it is that very few people who cause genuine pain to the people they love ever set out, at the beginning, intending cruelty. Far more often, they are simply frightened people making frightened decisions, and the damage accumulates quietly, in the dark, long before anyone realizes how far it has spread. If this part of the story is sitting heavy with you the way it still sits heavy with me, I understand completely. Take a breath with me for a moment. And while you are doing that, tell me, honestly, in the comments, have you ever discovered that someone you loved had been carrying a secret for years, out of fear rather than malice? I think so many of us have lived through some version of this, and I would be honored to hear a little of yours. If you have not yet subscribed, I would ask that you consider it now, because this story still has its most important chapter ahead of us, and I do not want you walking away before we reach it together. Maeve discovered the first thread of it almost entirely by accident, during what should have been an unremarkable afternoon at the university archive. A colleague researching the history of land transfers in West Cork had pulled, among hundreds of other documents, a registry filing connected to our small rental property out near Garrettstown, and had mentioned it to Maeve in passing simply because she recognized the family surname. Out of nothing more than idle curiosity, my daughter requested to see the file herself. What she found did not immediately reveal the entire truth. It revealed only an irregularity, a date that did not align cleanly with another date, a signature that appeared, upon closer inspection, very slightly different from previous filings bearing the same name. To anyone else, it would have meant nothing at all, an administrative oddity easily explained by a clerical error decades old. But Maeve is not anyone else. Maeve has spent her entire career trained to notice precisely these kinds of small, quiet inconsistencies, the sort that, taken individually, mean almost nothing, but taken together, begin to form the unmistakable outline of something deliberately hidden. She did not come to me with it. I want you to understand that clearly, because I have asked myself 1,000 times since why she chose silence over confrontation. And I believe now that I finally understand her reasoning, even if I cannot say I agree with it. She was afraid, I think, of being wrong. And she was equally afraid, perhaps more afraid, of being right. So instead, my brilliant, careful, methodical daughter began quietly investigating her own brother, the way she might investigate any historical mystery, gathering documents, cross-referencing dates, building a private folder of evidence over nearly 2 years, all while continuing to sit across from him at family dinners, continuing to wish him a happy birthday every November, continuing, in every outward way, to behave as though nothing at all had changed between them, except for one thing. She stopped saying his name. I believe now that this was never a punishment aimed at Ciaran, not really. I believe it was the only honest expression my daughter could allow herself of a grief she did not yet have permission, even from herself, to fully feel. Because to use his name was to acknowledge him as her brother in the fullest sense, the boy who held her hand along the rocks at Silly Walk, the boy who taught her to ride a bicycle on the road behind our house, the boy she had trusted completely, and she was no longer certain that boy still existed inside the man she now suspected of having deceived an entire family for years. So she called him instead, the way you might refer to a stranger, because some wounded part of her had genuinely begun to believe he had become one. I am going to stop here for just a moment, because I think this is precisely the place in the story where I most need you with me. Tell me, in the comments below, where you are watching from tonight, and what time it is wherever you are sitting right now. I find such comfort imagining all of you out there in your own kitchens, your own quiet evening hours, walking through this with me. If this story has moved something in you, please take half a moment and press that like button. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would consider it a genuine gift, because what happened next, at that dinner table, changed every single one of us in ways none of us could have predicted, and I am not nearly finished telling you about it. By the time that slim leather folder arrived under Maeve's arm at her father's birthday dinner, she had spent the better part of 2 years assembling a private, exhaustive record of every irregular filing, every altered date, every quiet financial maneuver her brother had executed across nearly a decade. She had not yet decided, that evening, exactly what she intended to do with it. I have asked her since, directly, whether she walked into that dining room already planning to stand up and speak. She told me, with the kind of brutal honesty that has always characterized her, that she genuinely did not know. She said she had carried that folder to a dozen family gatherings before that night, always intending, and never quite managing, to say a single word. What was different that particular evening, I believe, though she has never said this outright, was watching her father turn 75 years old, surrounded by old friends from the harbor board, by Father Cathal, by Aunt Nuala, by all of us raising glasses to a long, honest, hard-working life, and feeling the unbearable weight of knowing that the foundation beneath that life had been quietly, secretly altered without his knowledge or his consent. The dinner itself unfolded gently at first. Father Cathal told a long, meandering story about a fishing trip he and Declan had taken decades earlier that had ended with their small boat drifting nearly out past the harbor mouth before either of them noticed the tide had turned. A story I have heard perhaps 30 times over the years and laughed at every single one of them. Aunt Nuala produced an old photograph of Declan as a young man, impossibly thin, standing proudly beside his very first delivery van, which sent the whole table into gentle, affectionate laughter. Ciaran raised the first toast, warm and articulate as he has always been in public settings, speaking of his father's quiet steadiness, his patience, the particular way Declan had always made every person who walked into our home feel immediately welcome. I watched Maeve throughout that toast. She did not look at her brother. She looked instead at the leather folder resting on her lap beneath the table, her thumb tracing the edge of it the way a person might worry a rosary bead. Declan, in his own gentle way, eventually stood to thank everyone for coming, and then, in the sort of sentimental gesture that is entirely characteristic of my husband, he asked if anyone might like to share a memory, anything at all, before the cake was brought out. He meant it as a small, warm moment. He had no possible way of knowing what he was about to set into motion. There was a brief pause around the table, the polite hesitation of people deciding who should speak first. Aunt Nuala began drawing breath to offer something. I am certain of it, something lovely and uncomplicated about Declan as a boy. And then Maeve stood. I remember the particular sound her chair made against the wooden floor, a small scrape that seemed, in that suspended moment, impossibly loud. I remember the candlelight catching the edge of that leather folder as she lifted it from her lap and held it, not opened, simply held against her chest like something she needed close to her heart in order to find the courage to speak at all. I remember Declan's face, still smiling, still entirely unsuspecting, turning toward his daughter with the open, expectant warmth of a man who believed he was about to hear something sweet about his own childhood. I remember Chiron's expression shifting, almost imperceptibly, the easy public charm draining slightly from around his eyes, the way a man's face changes when he suspects, just barely, just for a fraction of a second, that the ground beneath him may not be quite as solid as he has spent years insisting it was. And I remember my own hands, wrapped around the stem of my wine glass, going suddenly, completely cold. Maeve did not raise her voice. I want you to understand that clearly, because so many of you, hearing this story unfold, might imagine shouting, accusations, the kind of dramatic confrontation that fills television dramas. That is not what happened. My daughter has never once, in her entire life, needed to raise her voice to make a room go utterly silent. She looked, very deliberately, not at her father, not at the assembled friends and family, but directly at her brother, and she said, in a voice that was calm, almost gentle, almost unbearably gentle given the weight of what was coming. I stopped calling him by his name, because the brother I grew up loving disappeared years ago, and none of us had the courage to admit it. The room did not gasp. It did something far stranger and, I think, far more honest. It simply stopped. Every fork rested against every plate. Every breath seemed to hold itself in the lungs of the person breathing it. Father Cathal's wine glass remained suspended halfway to his lips, frozen there as though time itself had briefly lost its grip on the evening. I looked around that table, and I want you to understand what I saw, because I think it matters as much as anything Maeve actually said. I saw confusion on some faces, the polite, uncertain confusion of people who suspected they had just witnessed something significant without understanding what it was. I saw Aunt Neula's hand find her own throat, the way mine has done 1,000 times in moments of shock. I saw Father Cathal lower his glass very slowly, his eyes moving carefully between Maeve and Ciaran, the practiced, patient watchfulness of a man who has spent a lifetime sitting with families in their most difficult, unguarded moments. And I saw Declan, my husband, my steady, gentle Declan, simply staring at our daughter with an expression I had genuinely never seen on his face before in 51 years of marriage. An expression that was not quite confusion and not quite fear, but something caught painfully between the two. Several guests, I learned afterward, genuinely believed Maeve was speaking metaphorically, perhaps referencing some private grief over the passage of time. The way siblings sometimes do drift apart through nothing more sinister than distance and different lives. One of Declan's oldest friends from the harbor board, a kind, careful man named Tomas, later admitted to me privately that he assumed, in that frozen moment, she was simply overcome with emotion, perhaps having had a little too much wine, and would sit back down momentarily with an embarrassed laugh and a clarifying joke. She did not sit back down. She stood there, that leather folder still pressed against her chest, looking at her brother across a table, suddenly stripped of every comfortable pretense we had all, collectively, silently, agreed to maintain for years. I want to pause us here, just for a moment, before we go further into what happened next, because I think you deserve a breath, the way I certainly needed one that night, sitting frozen in my green dress with my wine glass forgotten in my cold hands. Tell me in the comments what you think Maeve meant, what you imagine might be inside that folder she was holding so tightly against her chest. I love hearing your theories, truly, because some of you have a way of seeing around corners I never saw myself until I had already walked past them. If you have stayed with me this far, please give this video a like. It genuinely helps this story find the people who need to hear it tonight. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would ask you, gently, the way I might ask a neighbor for a small favor over the garden wall, to do so now, because what unfolded over the following weeks, the discoveries, the documents, the slow, painful unraveling of nearly a decade of careful secrecy, changed every single one of us, and I have a great deal more still left to tell you. One of Declan's old friends from the harbor board, a woman named Eithne, who has known our family for over 30 years and who happened to be seated nearest the door that evening, would later tell me that something about the particular phrase Maeve used, the suggestion that someone in our family had effectively disappeared while still standing among us, combined with the visible distress on Declan's face and the strange, tense silence that followed, troubled her deeply enough that she found herself, 2 days later, still unable to shake the worry that something serious might be unfolding within our family, something involving an elderly relative she cared for, and a situation she felt, in good conscience, she could not simply ignore. It was Eithne, in fact, who eventually made a quiet call to the appropriate local authorities, not out of any suspicion of violence, never that, but out of a genuine, well-meaning concern that what she had witnessed might involve an elderly person being taken advantage of. Perhaps financially, perhaps through some concealment of important legal matters. That single telephone call, made from a place of real care rather than malice, became the unexpected catalyst that forced nearly a decade of carefully hidden financial decisions out into the open air at last, where every one of us would finally be required to look directly at the truth we had each, in our own quiet ways, spent years avoiding. But that, I promise you, is a story I need a little more time and a little more breath to tell you properly. I want to thank you, sincerely, for staying with me this far. I know this story asks a great deal of patience from you, the way the truth so often does in real life, refusing to arrive all at once, insisting instead on revealing itself slowly, layer by layer, the way the tide here in Kinsale slowly uncovers the rocks at low water. Before I leave you for now, tell me where you are watching from. what time your own clock reads tonight, and whether you have ever sat at a table where one single sentence changed the entire shape of an evening. I read every comment, every single one, and I treasure them more than you know. Please, like this video if it has earned even a small piece of your heart tonight, and subscribe because I am not finished, not by a long way, and I would be honored to have you walk the rest of this road beside me. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a house after something irreversible has been said out loud, and I want to try, as best I can, to describe it to you, because I do not think there is any other silence quite like it in all the world. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence of a room still full of people who suddenly do not know what to do with their own hands. That was the silence that filled the private dining room above the harbor that night, after Maeve sat back down, after Declan slowly, carefully, lowered himself back into his own chair as though his legs had briefly forgotten how to hold him. Nobody touched the cake when it eventually arrived. Father Cathal said a quiet word of thanks for the food that nobody had the heart to correct him on, since thanks had already been said once before the silence began. We went home that night in near total quiet, Declan and I walking the short distance back up to Upper O'Connell Street with our coats pulled tight against the harbor wind, neither of us finding a single word that felt safe enough to say out loud. Before I take you further into what happened over the following days, I want to ask you something because I have wondered about this so often since. Have you ever lived through a silence like that? The kind that follows a single sentence powerful enough to rearrange an entire evening? I would love to hear about it in the comments below, truly, because I think so many of us carry at least one memory of a room that simply stopped breathing for a moment. If this story has its hand on your shoulder tonight, please give it a like, and if you have not yet subscribed, I would consider it the kindest of favors, because what happened next changed the shape of my family in ways I am only now, all these years later, fully able to put into words. For 3 full days after that dinner, nobody in our family spoke to anybody else about what had happened. I want you to understand how strange that is for us, because we are not, by nature, a quiet family. We are a family that argues over the proper way to make a stew, that debates the merits of different hurling teams with a passion bordering on the religious, that telephones one another simply to discuss the weather coming in off the Atlantic. And yet for 3 days, the telephone in our hallway sat utterly silent, and I found myself more than once simply standing beside it, my hand resting on the receiver, unable to decide who I might even begin to call. Declan retreated, in those days, to his garden, the way he has always retreated from anything too large for ordinary words. I would watch him from the kitchen window, kneeling among his runner beans in the cold March light, not actually doing any gardening at all, simply kneeling there with his hands resting on his knees, staring at something none of the rest of us could see. I did not disturb him. I have learned, across 51 years of marriage, that my husband processes grief the way the harbor itself processes a storm, slowly, privately, and almost entirely below the surface, where you cannot see the real work happening until long after it is done. On the 4th day, the telephone finally did ring, and it was not Maeve, and it was not Ciaran. It was a woman from a local support and safeguarding service connected to the Gardaí, calling, she explained with great gentleness, because a concerned member of the community had reached out regarding a possible situation involving an elderly person and some irregularities in financial and legal paperwork. She did not use the word investigation. She used the word inquiry, and she explained carefully that no one was accused of any wrongdoing, that this was simply a welfare check, the kind of call that gets made whenever someone expresses genuine concern about an older person's financial well-being, and that the matter would be handled with discretion and care. I sat down very slowly on the bottom step of our staircase while she spoke. The receiver pressed hard against my ear, my heart doing something strange and irregular in my chest. I asked her, my voice not entirely steady, who exactly had made this call. She told me, kindly but firmly, that she could not share that information, only that the concern raised had been about possible concealment of legal documents involving inheritance and property, nothing more serious than that, and that the elderly person in question, she gently clarified, appeared to be my husband. I want to pause here, because I remember so clearly the particular dizziness that swept through me in that moment, the strange sensation of the hallway tilting very slightly to one side. Declan. Elderly. The two words sat side by side in my mind in a way they had never quite sat before, not because I did not know my husband's age, but because nobody had ever spoken of him in quite that clinical, official way, as a person who might require protecting from his own family. If you are sitting with me in this moment, I thank you, because I know this part of the story asks something heavy of you. Tell me, in the comments, has a phone call ever changed the entire color of your day in under 60 seconds, the way that one changed mine? I would love to hear it, because I think we underestimate how often the most ordinary-sounding telephone calls carry inside them the power to rearrange an entire life. And if you have a moment, please do leave a like. It truly does help this story travel to the people who might need it tonight. Subscribe too, if you have not already, because there is still a great deal more road ahead of us. I rang Maeve that same afternoon, my hands shaking so badly I had to dial the number twice. I did not shout at her, though I will admit some part of me wanted to, some old maternal instinct that wished, briefly and uselessly, that I could simply demand she undo whatever had been set in motion. Instead, I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, whether she knew anything about a telephone call made to the safeguarding services regarding her father. There was a long pause on the line, longer than the one from that earlier telephone call about wine and bread. And then Maeve said, very quietly, that she had not made that call herself, but that she was not entirely surprised someone had. She told me, finally, after 2 years of silence, about the folder, about the land registry filing she had stumbled across by accident, about the dates that did not align, the signature that looked on close inspection very slightly wrong. She told me she had spent nearly 2 years gathering documents, quietly, methodically, the way she gathers documents at work, never quite certain what she intended to do with them, never quite able to bring herself to confront her brother directly, because some part of her, she admitted through what I could hear was real and genuine grief, had been desperately hoping she was simply wrong. I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper, what exactly she believed her brother had done. She told me she believed Kieran had, for years, secretly altered paperwork connected to our small rental property out near Garrettstown, moving money in ways that were never properly disclosed to either of us, and that she had no idea, even now, whether his reasons had been selfish or desperate, only that the concealment itself had been deliberate and sustained, and that she could no longer pretend, sitting across the dinner table from him every few months, that nothing at all had happened. I want to ask you something now, and I think this question matters a great deal to the rest of this story. When someone we love makes a frightening discovery about another person we love, whose side, if any, do we owe our first loyalty to? I genuinely do not know the answer, even after everything, and I would treasure hearing your own thoughts on it in the comments below. If this story is asking something honest of you tonight, give it a like and stay with me, because I promise you the truth, when it finally arrived in full, was far more complicated and far more human than any of us expected. I did not ring Ciaran that day. I could not bring myself to. Instead, I went up to the attic, climbing the narrow stairs slowly, my knees protesting every step the way they have done for the better part of a decade now, and I found my mother's old wooden box, the one with the small brass clasp. I took out the sealed letter Maeve had written to me but never sent, the one I had found weeks earlier and quietly returned without ever breaking its seal. I sat on the dusty attic floor for a long while, that letter resting in my lap, the afternoon light coming in pale and gray through the small round window that looks out over the rooftops toward the harbor. I want to tell you that I opened it immediately, driven by some urgent need to understand. The truth is gentler and stranger than that. I sat with it unopened for nearly an hour, simply holding it, because some part of me understood that whatever was written inside would change the shape of how I saw my own daughter, and I was not yet entirely ready to be changed. When I finally did open it, the paper inside was soft with age, the ink very slightly faded, dated nearly 2 years earlier. It was not an accusation. It was instead the most painful kind of letter a parent can ever receive, a letter written by a daughter trying, and ultimately failing, to find the courage to tell her own mother that she suspected her brother of deceiving the entire family and that she did not know how to carry that suspicion without breaking something none of us could ever fully repair. She had written, near the end of that letter, a single line that I have never been able to forget, and I do not believe I ever will. She wrote, "I am not angry with him. I am frightened of what loving him will cost me, if I am right." I want to give you a moment with that line, because it took my own breath away sitting alone in that attic, and I think it deserves a little space here too. Tell me in the comments what that single sentence stirs in you. Have you ever loved someone while simultaneously fearing the truth about them? If this story has reached down into something real in your own life tonight, please take a moment and like this video. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would be deeply grateful, because we are approaching the part of this story where everything finally, painfully, comes into the light. Over the following 2 weeks, the family began, almost against its own will, to splinter into camps. Aunt Nuala, fiercely loyal to her nephew in the particular way aunts often are, insisted the entire matter must be some terrible misunderstanding, that Ciaran had never in his life taken a single thing that did not belong to him, and that Maeve, in her words, had always been the dramatic one, prone to seeing shadows where there was only ordinary daylight. Tomas, Declan's old friend from the Harbour Board, took a gentler but equally skeptical position, suggesting privately to me, over tea at his own kitchen table, that surely whatever paperwork irregularities existed had a simple, boring explanation, the kind that always turns up eventually in matters involving old land registries and decades of bureaucratic carelessness. Father Cathal, to his enormous credit, refused to take any side at all, insisting only that the truth, whatever it eventually proved to be, deserved to be allowed to surface in its own time, and that none of us, himself included, were in any position yet to judge a single thing. I clung to that small piece of wisdom more tightly than I clung to almost anything else during those weeks. Declan, meanwhile, said almost nothing. He continued his quiet retreats to the garden, though I noticed, with a particular ache in my chest, that he had stopped tending the runner beans with his usual care, leaving them to grow wild and unstaked along the back wall, as though some essential thread of attention inside him had simply gone slack. I want to pause here and ask you something a little different. Have you ever watched someone you love grow quiet in a way that frightens you more than shouting ever could? I think silence, in families, is so often mistaken for peace, when very often it is simply grief wearing a more acceptable disguise. If you recognize that in your own life, tell me about it below. I read every single comment with real attention. And please, give this story a like if it has earned even a small corner of your heart tonight, and subscribe, because what came next required every ounce of courage this family had left between us. The safeguarding inquiry, as it turned out, moved with a particular bureaucratic patience that nearly drove me to distraction during those weeks. A kind, methodical man named Detective Garda Niall Brennan was eventually assigned to look into the financial irregularities Maeve's documentation had raised, though he was careful, every time we spoke, to explain that this was, at this stage, an inquiry rather than any kind of formal accusation, and that the process of examining old land registry filings, bank records, and property documents going back nearly a decade would necessarily take time. He explained, with what I came to recognize as genuine kindness rather than mere procedure, that financial matters of this nature rarely resolve themselves quickly, and that patience, however agonizing, was simply part of allowing the truth the room it needed to fully surface. It was during one of these conversations with Detective Garda Brennan that I learned something that nearly buckled my knees beneath me. He mentioned, in passing, almost as an aside, that the small business venture connected to the irregular filings appeared to have failed during an economic downturn roughly 8 years earlier, and that the pattern of financial movement he was examining suggested someone attempting, rather clumsily but persistently, to repay funds over an extended period rather than simply disappear with them. I remember standing in my own kitchen, the telephone pressed to my ear, feeling something shift inside my understanding of my own son for the very first time. Not absolution, not yet, but something else. A crack of light where before there had only been a closed and frightening door. I want to ask you, before we go any further together, whether you have ever had a single piece of new information completely rearrange your understanding of someone you thought you already knew completely. I would love to hear about it, truly, in the comments below. And if this story has you leaning forward the way I was leaning forward in my own kitchen that afternoon, please give it a like and stay with me, because the unexpected ally who finally helped piece together the full and complicated truth of what my son had done, and why, arrived from a place none of us could possibly have predicted. That ally was Sinead, Ciaran's former wife, who had remained, despite the ending of their marriage, on warm enough terms with our entire family that she still sent Declan a Christmas card every year without fail. Sinead rang me one evening, her voice careful, clearly weighing every word before she spoke it, and told me that she had heard, through a mutual friend still connected to Galway business circles, that the small venture Ciaran had invested in all those years ago had been a genuine catastrophe, one that had nearly ruined 2 other families besides our own, and that she remembered vividly the particular autumn when her husband had stopped sleeping properly, had grown thin and gray, and frightened in a way she had never seen before or since. She told me she had always wondered privately what exactly had frightened him so badly that year, and that she had never asked because their marriage was already faltering for entirely separate reasons, and she had not felt it was her place. But she told me something else too, something that settled into my chest like a stone dropped slowly into still water. She told me that whatever Ciaran had done during that frightening autumn, she did not believe, not for one single moment, that he had done it out of greed. She said she had never in her life seen a man so thoroughly haunted by guilt over money that, as far as she could tell, he had never once spent on himself. If you are still with me tonight, I want you to know how deeply grateful I am, because I understand this story asks patience of you, the same patience it demanded of all of us during those long, uncertain weeks. Tell me, in the comments, where you are listening from and what time your own clock reads right now. I treasure imagining all of you out there, scattered across the world, sitting with this old woman's memories. Please give this video a like if it has found its way into something real in you tonight, and subscribe, because what happens next, the full unraveling of nearly a decade of careful secrecy, the moment my son finally told the entire truth, and the dining table where every one of us finally saw the same story from every angle at once, is the part of this story I have waited my whole life to be able to tell someone, and I am so grateful that someone tonight is you. There is a moment in every family story like this one, where the careful, patient gathering of small pieces finally becomes something larger than the sum of its parts, where documents and dates and quiet telephone calls suddenly arrange themselves into a shape you can no longer look away from. For my family, that moment arrived on an unremarkable Thursday afternoon in April, nearly 6 weeks after Declan's birthday dinner, in the form of a single brown envelope delivered to my own front door. I want to ask you something before I take you into what that envelope contained, because I think it matters. Have you ever held a piece of paper in your hands and known, before you had even fully opened it, that your understanding of someone you loved was about to change forever? I would love to hear about that feeling in the comments below, because I think there is something almost physical about it, a weight that settles into your fingers before it ever reaches your mind. If this story has its grip on you tonight, please give it a like. It helps more than you know. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would consider it a true kindness, because what I am about to tell you is the very heart of everything that happened in my family. The envelope was from Detective Garda Brennan, and inside it was a formal letter explaining that the financial inquiry into our family's property records had been concluded, that no criminal charges would be pursued against my son, and that the irregularities identified had ultimately been determined to involve the unauthorized but eventually fully repaid use of funds, conducted without any intention of permanent deprivation, and resolved entirely through Kieran's own efforts over the preceding several years. The letter used careful, measured language, the kind designed to inform without inflaming. But underneath that careful language sat an undeniable truth. My son had done exactly what Maeve suspected, and he had also, eventually, made every single thing right, quietly, alone, without ever once asking for help or absolution. I rang Maeve immediately, and I rang Kieran immediately after, and I asked both of them, in turn, the same simple request. I asked them to come home to Kinsale, to sit at my own kitchen table, the one that has held 51 years of family dinners and arguments and reconciliations, and to finally tell this story to each other in full, with nothing held back, nothing softened, nothing left in a sealed envelope or a locked leather folder. Before I tell you what happened around that table, I need you to understand one thing clearly. I had not planned for this to become a confrontation. I had planned, in my own quiet way, for it to become a reckoning, the gentlest kind I could manage, the kind built not on accusation, but on the simple, overdue act of finally speaking the truth out loud to the people it most belonged to. If you are bracing yourself the way I was bracing myself that morning, laying out the good teacups, setting Declan's mother's biscuit tin in the center of the table the way I have done for every difficult family conversation across 5 decades, I understand completely. Tell me, in the comments, have you ever prepared a room for a conversation you knew might change everything? I find such strange comfort in those small domestic rituals, the tea, the biscuits, the ordinary objects we cling to when the moment ahead of us feels anything but ordinary. Please, give this story a like if you are feeling that same held breath alongside me, and subscribe, because what was said around that table that afternoon deserves to be told to you in full, exactly as it happened. Kieran arrived first, looking older than I had ever seen him look. The easy public charm I had watched him wear at his father's birthday dinner entirely absent now, replaced by something far more raw and far more honest. He sat down across from me without a word, his hands folded tightly on the tabletop, and when Maeve arrived 20 minutes later, carrying that same slim leather folder, the two of them simply looked at each other across the kitchen for a long, unbearable moment before either of them spoke. It was Kieran who finally broke the silence, and I want to tell you exactly what he said, because I have turned his words over in my mind so many times since that I believe I could recite them perfectly even now. He said, "I have spent 8 years rehearsing how I would tell this story, and somehow I still do not know how to begin." Maeve, to her credit, said nothing at first. She simply set the leather folder on the table between them, unopened, and waited. Kieran began slowly, his voice catching more than once, describing the small Galway business he had invested in alongside 2 old university friends, a modest enterprise importing specialty building materials that had seemed, in the years before the downturn, like a genuinely sound investment. He described the particular autumn 8 years earlier when one of those friends had rung him in a panic, explaining that a critical shipment contract had collapsed overnight, that the business was facing immediate insolvency, and that without an urgent injection of funds within the week, not only the business but the personal homes of both his partners, families he had known for over 20 years, stood to be lost entirely. He told us he had no savings of his own sufficient to cover what was needed. He told us, his voice dropping nearly to a whisper, that in a moment of pure panic, sitting alone in his flat in Galway at 2 a.m. with the paperwork for our small Garrettstown property open on the table in front of him, paperwork he had legitimate access to manage on our behalf, He had made the worst decision of his entire life. He had used a portion of those funds, legally still belonging to his father and myself, to stabilize the failing business, fully intending, he insisted again, his eyes wet now, to repay every single cent before either of us ever noticed a difference. I want to pause here, because I think this is exactly the place where so many of you listening tonight might find yourselves judging my son harshly, and I do not blame you if you do. I judged him too in that moment, even as I listened with everything in me trying to remain open. But I want you to sit with something alongside me. Have you ever made a decision in a moment of genuine panic that you would never, under any calmer circumstances, have made at all? I think very few of us are entirely innocent of that particular human failing, even if the scale of our own panicked decisions has never quite reached the scale of my son's. Tell me honestly in the comments, and please, give this video a like if you find yourself, as I did, holding both anger and understanding in the same breath. Subscribe too, because we are nearly at the heart of everything now, and I do not want you to miss a single word of what came next. Ciaran explained that the repayment had taken nearly 6 years, far longer than he had ever anticipated, because the building materials business, even once stabilized, recovered slowly, and because he had insisted on repaying not only the principal amount, but interest, he calculated himself, a private penance, he admitted, that nobody had ever asked him to pay. He had altered the property's paperwork repeatedly during those years, he explained, not to hide a crime exactly, but to keep the official record clean enough that neither Declan nor I would ever stumble across evidence of what he had done, sparing us, he believed, from a worry he felt was entirely his own burden to carry. I told myself, he said, his hands shaking now around his teacup, that if I fixed it before either of you ever found out, then nobody would ever have to be hurt by it. I told myself that was protecting you. I understand now that it was only protecting myself from having to watch your faces while I told you the truth. Maeve finally opened the leather folder and laid out one by one across my kitchen table, nearly 2 years of carefully gathered documentation, the irregular filing dates, the slightly altered signatures, the quiet trail she had followed entirely alone, never once telling a single member of the family what she suspected, carrying that suspicion privately for longer than I think any of us fully understood until that very afternoon. I needed to know I wasn't imagining it, she said, her own voice unsteady now. I needed to know before I let myself believe my own brother had done something he could never tell us about. And then once I knew, I didn't know how to say it without breaking everything. So I stopped saying your name instead. I think some part of me thought if I never said it out loud, I could keep loving the brother I remembered without having to face the man I was afraid you'd become. I want to ask you something now, because I think it sits at the very center of everything this story has been trying to teach me. Is silence ever truly an act of love, or is it always, underneath, a quieter kind of abandonment? I have asked myself that question more times than I can count since that afternoon at my kitchen table, and I still do not have a single settled answer. I would treasure hearing your own thoughts in the comments below. And if this part of the story has reached into something tender in you tonight, please give it a like. It truly does mean a great deal. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would ask you gently to consider doing so now, because I have not yet told you what happened when Declan finally walked into that kitchen and heard the whole truth for the very first time. I had asked Declan to wait in the front room while the 3 of us spoke, not out of any wish to exclude him, but because I wanted Ciaran and Maeve to find their own way back to each other before their father's presence added another layer of weight to an already unbearable conversation. But Declan, as it happened, had been standing in the hallway for the better part of 20 minutes, close enough to hear most of what had been said, unable, in the end, to stay away from a conversation that concerned the very foundation of his own quiet, hard-working life. He stepped into the kitchen slowly, and I watched both of our children turn toward him with identical expressions of dread, the particular dread of children, no matter their age, bracing themselves for their father's judgment. Declan did not shout. I want you to understand that, because shouting has never once, in 51 years, been a language my husband speaks. He simply stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at his son, and then he asked a single question, his voice rough with something I had only heard in it a handful of times across our entire marriage. Did you think so little of me? He asked. That you believed I could not have survived the truth alongside you? Chiron broke then, fully, in a way I had not seen him break since he was a small boy who had accidentally broken his grandmother's good teapot and stood frozen with guilt in our old kitchen doorway, certain the whole world was about to end. He said he was sorry, again and again, the words spilling out of him faster than he could properly shape them. And Declan, my steady, patient husband, crossed the kitchen and simply put both hands on his son's shoulders, the way he used to do when Ciaran was a boy frightened of thunder, and said nothing further at all, because sometimes, I have learned, there is nothing further that needs saying. I want to pause here, just for a moment, because I think this particular image, my husband's hands on our son's shoulders in the kitchen where I have fed this family for half a century, is one I will carry with me for whatever years remain to me. Tell me, in the comments, has there ever been a single gesture, wordless and small, that said more to you than an entire conversation could have managed? I would love to hear about it. And please, if this story has earned a place in your heart tonight, give it a like, and stay with me, because the truth, once it was finally fully spoken at that table, still required a great deal more healing before any of us could call ourselves whole again. And I have not yet told you everything that healing eventually cost, nor everything it eventually gave each one of us in return. There is a particular kind of quiet that follows a storm at sea, the kind sailors here in Kinsale know better than almost anyone, where the water does not simply calm itself the moment the wind dies down, but instead spends hours afterwards settling, swell by swell, into something resembling stillness again. That is the best way I know to describe the months that followed that afternoon at my kitchen table, when my son finally told the truth in full and my husband simply placed his hands on his shoulders and said nothing more. Before I take you into how our family slowly, imperfectly, found its way back toward something whole, I want to ask you something, because I think it matters a great deal to everything that follows. Have you ever lived through the strange, uneven aftermath of a truth finally being spoken? The way the relief and the grief seem to arrive together, tangled up in one another so thoroughly that you can hardly tell where one ends and the other begins? I would love to hear about that feeling in the comments below, because I think so few of us are ever properly warned that the truth, once it finally arrives, does not immediately heal anything on its own. It simply clears the ground so that healing finally becomes possible. If this story has walked alongside you this far, please give it a like. It means more to an old woman like myself than you could possibly know. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would treasure it, because I am determined to tell you the whole of this story properly, right through to its very last word. It took, in the end, nearly a year before Ciaran and Maeve could sit across from one another without that particular careful distance hovering between them, the kind that exists between two people who love each other deeply, but have not yet entirely relearned how to trust the ground beneath that love. They did not repair things quickly, and I want to be honest with you about that, because I think we are so often told in the stories we are handed that forgiveness arrives in a single dramatic moment, a tearful embrace, a clean and total resolution. That is not how it happened in my family, and I have come to believe it is rarely how it happens in any family worth the name. What happened instead was slower and quieter, and in its own way, far more remarkable. Ciaran began, that very same spring, ringing Maeve directly rather than always routing his news and his worries through me, the way he had quietly fallen into doing over the previous several years. Small calls at first, about nothing important, the price of diesel, a piece of news from Galway, the sort of ordinary conversation that meant almost nothing on its own, but meant everything in its persistence. Maeve, for her part, began very gradually, saying his name again. I remember the first time I heard her do it, nearly 4 months after that afternoon at my kitchen table, mentioning in passing that Kieran had recommended a particular archive in Galway that might hold records relevant to a project she was working on. She said it so naturally, so entirely without weight, that it took me a full moment to register what I had just heard. I had to set down the cup of tea I was holding and simply sit with it for a while. If you have ever waited a very long time to hear someone you love speak a name again, the way I waited to hear my daughter speak her brother's, I think you understand exactly the particular ache and the particular joy that single ordinary sentence can carry. Tell me in the comments whether you have ever experienced a small, unremarkable moment that meant far more than it appeared to from the outside. I cherish reading these stories from you, truly, more than I think you know. And if this part of my story has settled into your chest the way it settled into mine, please leave it a like and consider subscribing, because the final shape this family eventually found, the shape we live inside even now, deserves to be told to you in full. I want to tell you what happened to Kieran's standing within the family more broadly, because I think it matters, and I think it is more complicated than a simple story of forgiveness and moving forward. Aunt Nuala, who had so fiercely defended him in the early weeks, struggled, oddly, far more than the rest of us once the full truth finally emerged, because she had built her defense of him on a certainty that turned out to be only partly correct, and she has never been a woman comfortable admitting she misjudged a situation. It took her the better part of 2 years to fully reconcile what she had believed about her nephew with what she eventually had to accept was true. And even now, though she loves him as fiercely as ever, there is a particular carefulness in how she speaks about that period, a carefulness I recognize because I have it too. Tomas, Declan's old friend from the harbor board, surprised me in the end by being one of the gentlest voices in the whole affair once the truth was fully known. He came to our house one evening, not long after everything had settled into the open, and told Declan over a glass of whiskey at our own kitchen table that he had once, decades earlier, made a financial decision of his own in a moment of pure panic, a decision he had never told a single living soul about, and that he understood, better than perhaps anyone else in that room. The particular suffocating loneliness of carrying a secret you believe will destroy everything if it ever sees the light. I do not know even now what Tomas's secret was, and I have never asked him, because I think some truths are not mine to know, only mine to honor by leaving them undisturbed. I want to pause here, because I think there is something important in what Tomas offered that evening, a kind of grace that asked for nothing in return. Have you ever received unexpected understanding from someone you did not expect to understand at all? I would love to hear about it in the comments below, because I think kindness like that, arriving from an unexpected direction, has a way of healing parts of us that the people closest to us sometimes cannot reach. Please give this story a like if that resonates with you tonight. And stay with me, because I have not yet told you what became of Kieran in the fullest sense, nor what this entire ordeal eventually taught every single one of us about the particular weight and the particular cost of silence. Legally, in the end, very little happened to my son, and I want to be honest with you about that too, because I know some of you listening tonight may feel that an injustice was somehow allowed to stand. The inquiry concluded exactly as Detective Garda Brennan had indicated it would, with no criminal charges pursued, given that the funds in question had been fully repaid, with interest, well before any formal complaint had ever been raised, and given that no party involved, including Declan and myself, the very people whose funds had been used without our knowledge, wished to pursue any further legal action against him. I understand that some families, in similar circumstances, choose differently, and I want to say clearly that I do not believe their choice would have been wrong. Every family must weigh these things according to its own particular history, its own particular capacity for forgiveness, and its own particular understanding of what justice actually requires in order to mean something real. For our family, justice did not arrive in the form of punishment. It arrived in the form of truth finally spoken aloud, in the form of years of quiet, grinding repayment that Siren had already completed long before any of us ever knew to ask it of him, and in the form of a son finally allowing his own father to know him fully, flaws included, rather than continuing to present only the carefully managed version of himself he had maintained for the better part of a decade. Declan, for his own part, took the longest of any of us to fully settle his own feelings about what had happened, and I think that surprised even him. He is not, as I have told you, a man given to dramatic emotion, but I watched him, in the months that followed, return again and again to a particular quiet grief that had nothing to do with the money at all, and everything to do with the simple, devastating fact that his own son had not believed, for 8 long years, that his father was strong enough to be trusted with the truth. It was nearly 18 months later, on a mild evening in early autumn, the kind where the light over the harbor turns a particular soft gold before it fades, that Declan finally said something to me that I believe brought him the last measure of peace he needed. We were sitting together in the back garden, among the runner beans he had finally begun tending properly again, and he said, without any particular preamble, that he had decided, somewhere along the way, that he would rather have a son who had made one terrible, frightened mistake and eventually found the courage to confess it fully, than a son who had never been tested at all, and therefore never had the chance to prove what he was truly made of underneath the fear. I want to give you a moment with that thought, because it has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from this entire story. Tell me, in the comments, what you make of it, whether you believe a person's worst decision, fully confessed and fully repaired, can ever come to mean something different than simple failure. I would treasure your thoughts on this more than you know. And if this story is asking something honest of you tonight, please give it a like. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would consider it a genuine gift, because we are nearly at the very end of this particular road, and I want you with me for every last step of it. Maeve's own healing took a different shape entirely, and I think it is worth telling you about, because I believe it carries its own particular lesson. She has continued, in the years since, working at the university archive, surrounded daily by the careful, preserved fragments of other people's hidden histories. And she told me once, not long ago, over tea at her own small kitchen table in Cork, that the entire experience had changed the way she understood her own profession. She said she used to believe that the documents she preserved were simply records of fact, neutral things, dates and signatures and land transfers, important only for the bureaucratic truths they contained. She told me she understands now that every document she has ever handled, every old letter and parish record and property filing, sits at the center of some family's own private silence, some story very much like ours that the paper itself can never fully explain, only quietly point toward. She has begun, in her own small way, treating her work differently because of this. She told me she pauses now, before filing away even the most ordinary-seeming document, to wonder what it might have cost the people connected to it to live through whatever it represents. I think that is a particular kind of grace, the sort that grows directly out of suffering and somehow manages to turn outward rather than inward, becoming, in the end, a gift to strangers she will never meet rather than a wound she simply nurses alone. If you have ever found that your own hardest experiences eventually reshaped the way you treat other people, even people who have nothing to do with your original pain, I would love to hear about that transformation in the comments below. I think it is one of the more beautiful things our species manages to do with suffering when we allow it the chance. Please give this story a like if that idea has found a home in you tonight, and subscribe, because I have one final piece of this story left to tell you, and I think, of everything I have shared tonight, it may be the part that matters most. I want to tell you now about the dinner we held, almost exactly 2 years after that first terrible birthday dinner. To mark Declan's 77th year, held in that very same private dining room above the harbor, with that same view of the boats bobbing gently in the marina below, the same candlelight, very nearly the same guest list, Aunt Nuala and Father Cathal and Thomas, and old friends from the harbor board. This time, when Declan stood to thank everyone for coming and asked, as he always does, whether anyone might like to share a memory before the cake arrived, it was Chiron who rose first, not Maeve. He did not hold any folder against his chest. He simply stood, raised his glass, and said that he wanted to thank his sister, by name, fully, in front of every person who loved them both, for having had the courage 2 years earlier to say something none of the rest of us had been brave enough to say, and for never once, even during the hardest months that followed, allowing her love for him to disappear entirely beneath her anger, even when he had given her every reason to let it. Maeve, sitting across the table, did not say anything in response. She simply reached across, took her brother's hand, the same hand that had once guided her safely along the rocks at Scilly Walk when she was 8 years old and he was 14, and held it there, in plain view of the entire table, for the length of one long, unhurried breath. I have told you, across these last hours together, that I always believed families broke apart through dramatic betrayals, the sort of thing you read about in newspapers or see acted out in films, sudden and violent and impossible to misunderstand. I have learned, through everything my own family lived through, that this is very rarely how it actually happens. Families do not usually shatter all at once. They erode slowly, the way the cliffs out past Charles Fort erode, grain by grain, wave by patient wave, through nothing more dramatic than ordinary people choosing, again and again, small silence over difficult honesty, convenient avoidance over uncomfortable truth. And I have learned something else too, something I do not think I could have learned any other way except by living through it myself, at 76 years old, in a stone house on Upper O'Connell Street that has held 3 generations of this family's joy and this family's grief in equal measure. I have learned that the opposite of betrayal is not perfection. It is honesty, offered even when it is frightening, even when it costs something real, even when the person offering it cannot yet be certain it will be received with grace rather than rejection. My son was not a villain in this story, and my daughter was not entirely innocent in her own long silence either. They were simply 2 people, each carrying a fear they did not know how to put down, until finally, around an ordinary kitchen table, they found they no longer had the strength left to keep carrying it alone. As the decorations from that second birthday dinner were quietly taken down from the empty dining room later that evening, the candles extinguished one by one, the boats outside still bobbing gently against their moorings, the way they have done in this harbor for centuries. I stood for a long moment at the window, watching the lights of Kinsale reflected on the dark water, and I understood, finally and completely, that my daughter had spoken her brother's name again, not because everything between them had been perfectly repaired, because I do not believe anything in a family is ever perfectly repaired, but because the silence had finally, after so many years, stopped carrying all the weight it had once carried alone. I want to thank you, with my whole heart, for staying with me through every part of this story, for sitting with an old woman's memories the way you might sit with a friend at her kitchen table, patient through the silences, present through the hardest parts. If this story has given you something tonight, some small piece of understanding about your own family, your own silences, your own courage still waiting to be found, I would be so grateful if you would tell me about it in the comments below, in whatever words feel honest to you. Tell me where you are watching from, what time it is wherever you are sitting tonight, and if you truly listened all the way to the end, leave me a single word in the comments that I think captures everything this story has been trying to say, the word reconciled, because only the people who walked this whole road with me will understand exactly why that particular word matters so much to me. Please, if this story moved you even a little, give it a like, and subscribe if you have not already, because there is always a new story waiting here, another family, another silence, another small act of courage worth telling. And if you know someone who might need to hear tonight that it is never too late to say a name again, that honesty, however frightening, is always kinder in the end than the silence we tell ourselves is protecting the people we love. Please share this story with them. You never know whose evening it might quietly change. Take good care of the people you love tonight, and take good care of each other out there. From one grandmother's kitchen table in Kinsale to wherever you are sitting tonight, thank you, truly, for listening all the way to the end.